Welcome to Tales of American History, the Witnessing History Education Foundation podcast, educating Americans to understand the history of their country and of other countries so that they will appreciate the value of America's unique, free institutions. Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org, the website of the Witnessing History Education Foundation. View for free the Foundation's documentary films on the website and on the Foundation's YouTube platform. View also the Foundation's free teacher education materials that conform to grade-level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, take a journey back through time with Kent Masterson Brown and his guest, Sam Hood. Sam is a West Virginia native who graduated from Kentucky Military Institute, then Marshall University, and then served in the United States Marine Corps. He is the author of several books on the Civil War, the latest of which is Patriots Twice, Former Confederates and the Building of America After the Civil War. Sam Hood will discuss with Kent the fascinating stories of the men who were these Patriots Twice, men who served the Confederacy well and ably and, after the war, were called upon by the United States government, colleges, universities, and professional associations such as the ABA and the AMA and other organizations all across America. Welcome, Sam. And now, here's Kent Masterson Brown.
I've got with me Stephen M. Hood, and Sam, we call him Sam Hood. Sam, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm going to enjoy it, I can tell.
Well, I like to talk, and you like to talk, so maybe this will work.
Yeah.
Sam, you've published a book called Patriots Twice, Former Confederates in the Building of America After the Civil War. I find this book absolutely not only fascinating, but I find it so timely in today's culture. Tell the audience, if you would, just what does the book present to them in a big picture?
Well, in the broad sense, as we all know, I'm assuming everybody that's listening, there's this broad reassessment of our historical characters, our founding fathers and prominent historical characters, and probably, I suppose, aside from the Revolutionary War, the most historic and monumental event in American history has to be the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And right. I got curious as to what the defeated Confederates did after the war.
Right.
And it's in the context of, if we're doing reassessments, and it seems like the critical aspects of a historic character's life seems to be a lot of focus not on what they did that the monument was erected for, but what else did they do, and right. the whole person, And I thought, what it seems like the only thing that's focused on the Confederates is what happened during the war.
Right.
And so I started looking into. I thought, well, what did these guys do after the war? Mm-hmm. So again, it's in the broad assessment. Yeah. And if we're going to look at the bad and the good, let's look at the bad and the good.
Right.
And
right.
So that's basically the theme.
And for purposes of the book, tell the listeners how many former Confederates you used in the book to tell the story of what they did after the war.
I did not have any particular criteria. I just started studying and looking up, biographies, whatever information I could find on Confederates, and it was totally subjective. Mm-hmm. And when I speak, as I explain to people, I had to keep raising the bar just due to physical constraints of the book, unless you wanted to do a multi-volume. And I ended up with, I kept raising the bar, and there's many of these men who probably deserve to be remembered and recognized and chronicled. But I ended up with roughly 200 or more than 200, some of them just in the appendix. But probably 150, 175 perhaps that I actually gave a summarized biography of what their Confederate service was,
Right.
and what the achievements were after the war.
Right. And in terms of these former Confederates, their achievements after the war covered a lot of things. Some were in the Army, United States Army. Some were college presidents. Some were presidents of great trade associations. Some were in the federal government. Hard to believe, but there were. And you cover all of those categories, don't you, in this?
I do. In addition to federal government, state governments of non-Confederate states.
Right.
Of the northern states, or states that were created, attained statehood after the war, and cities, mayors of unlikely cities. You mentioned, trade associations or professional societies, AMA, ABA, and some of those.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And college founders.
Right.
And college founders and presidents and board members and those things.
Right. And Board of Visitors members.
Right. Or Board of Governors, Board of Visitors, Board of Directors, as whatever the university calls it.
Let's start with the Army, the military.
U.S. Army.
U.S. Army. Tell the listeners some prominent Confederates who became prominent in the United States Army after the Civil War.
Yeah. Kent, I think you would agree with this, or any historian. No book should ever be called The History of Something. It should be called A History of Something.
I agree.
Because stuff is found all the time.
All the time.
So I identified 8 United States Army generals during the Spanish-American War, and it's interesting. I ended up learning about events and characters that I really hadn't had a sufficient level of curiosity to like Grover Cleveland.
Yeah.
All I knew about Grover Cleveland was that there was a great major league pitcher named Grover Cleveland Alexander. Back at the turn of the century, but Grover Cleveland, learned about him. But also the Spanish-American War. I didn't know anything about the Spanish. I just know it happened.
Yeah, right.
But the Spanish-American War was the first conflict, major or minor. It was the first conflict after the Civil War.
Right.
And it was really intriguing. It's almost like the defeated Confederates. It was almost like they got a mulligan. They got a do-over. And there were, when they called for volunteers, because, the U.S. Army was very small during the years after the Civil War. And it was kind of like when Lincoln called for volunteers for the Civil War. They ended up with like 10 times as many as they were expecting.
Right.
And many of these came from the South. And I actually have, in the book, I have some examples of some circulars that were put out, or announcements or letters that had gone out by the United Confederate Veterans, encouraging the sons of our sons and our younger troops to volunteer, and they wanted to join up with the U.S.
Yeah.
And but anyway, the 8 that I recalled, 8 generals of volunteers, though I'm thinking maybe Joe Wheeler was actually regular Army, but I ended up locating 8, and Thomas Rosser, Fitzhugh Lee, Joe Wheeler, Castleman,
J.B. Castleman.
J.B. Castleman, Louisville,
Right.
Kentucky, Douglas Gordon, Matthew Butler, and the most interesting one, by anybody's measurement, would be Joe Wheeler.
Right.
Joe Wheeler and one of his subordinate commanders was a young Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
This is at San Juan Hill.
At San Juan Hill,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Actually in combat.
Yeah.
And commanded troops in combat. And now some of these 8 generals, some of them were still training and still organizing their units, and there were a couple that were actually en route to either the Philippines or to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
But Joe Wheeler was actually commanding a combat
Yeah.
division
Right.
or corps.
Yeah.
And Teddy Roosevelt. And by the way, in addition to Grover Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt, you could write a book just on the Confederates, on the former Confederates that those 2 presidents appointed to their administrations. There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
And Teddy
yeah.
Roosevelt probably had a lot to do not only with his mother, who was
From Georgia.
from
yeah.
Georgia,
From
very
Georgia.
much a Southern
Oh,
gal,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
but also probably service under Joe Wheeler.
Yeah. And for purposes of the audience here, Joe Wheeler, during the Civil War, was a general officer in the Confederate Army, cavalry commander in the Army of Tennessee. He served during the Bragg's invasion of Kentucky as the commander of cavalry in the Army of then the Mississippi. So he had a distinguished career as a Confederate general officer commanding cavalry. And here he is as a general officer commanding United States Army troops at San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt as one of his subordinate commanders.
Right.
It's a stunning thing to think about.
Yeah.
But he's not the only one. I mean, J.B. Castleman, John Breckinridge Castleman. I mean, he actually comes from Lexington. Mm-hmm. Born over on what's called Castleton Farm on the Ironworks Pike. It's all still there. Nephew of John Cabell Breckinridge. He had served under John Hunt Morgan in the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry, which you chronicle in your book. And then after the war, tell the audience what he did.
Well, if the number of these listeners are from Kentucky, they're probably going to know.
There are a lot of them.
Yeah, probably going to know more than I do. But after the war in Louisville, he is credited with being the founder or the creator of the Louisville Park system.
Right.
Iroquois Park,
Cherokee
Park. Right. They're named after Native American tribes.
Right.
Also, again, it's in the book. Libraries. One of the libraries, and I think he was involved in one of the orphanages. Either founded it or was served on the board. Very much a civic-minded individual.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he raised a command to fight in the Spanish-American War as well.
Kentucky Volunteers. Yeah.
And they were federalized, I take it. And he then became a brigadier general in the United States Army.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so he was a major in the Confederate Army.
Right.
But he got elevated to brigadier general in the United States Army.
Yeah. Of the 8 U.S. Army generals in the Spanish-American War, the lowest ranking Confederate was a captain. But 4 of them were generals and, a couple of colonels and a major captain. I believe it was Gordon.
Yeah.
So,
And then Castleman, too, was at Puerto Rico. Wasn't he the first United States governor of Puerto Rico?
The military governor.
Governor?
I believe he was,
Yeah.
Well, another interesting thing we're talking before we went on air, we're talking about John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood, one of his sons, graduated from West Point, and Duncan Norbert Hood, and he was also in the Spanish-American War, and he was after the war, which was very short, very brief war. He was the military governor, the military mayor of the city of Santiago.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So of Cuba, but the Castleman, I believe, was Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Well, sadly, the mayor of Louisville ordered Castleman's equestrian statue on Cherokee Park removed because he had served in the Confederate Army.
Right.
And yet here's this man who, after the war, became a brigadier general in the United States Army, serving in Puerto Rico, military governor of Puerto Rico, and beyond that was president of the American Saddle Horse Museum, Horse Association, and then the founder of really the park system of Louisville. And his equestrian statue was put in Cherokee Park because he was the park commissioner that created this.
Right.
And they took it down.
Right. And as I understand it, the statue, he was not in his Confederate military garb.
No. Past that statue many times. He's in civilian attire because he was president.
Being memorialized for what he did as a civilian.
As a civilian, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So, there's even no redemption for these fellas.
Sure.
And that's the sad thing.
Well, we use the word reconciliation.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that in the years immediately after the war by the guys that were trying to kill each other.
Oh, I know.
And here we are 150 years later, and the great-great-great-grandchildren can't seem to reconcile.
No. Yeah. We have a funeral home here in town known as W.R. Millward. And that is named for Colonel W.R. Millward, who commanded a Kentucky infantry Union regiment during the Civil War. I think it was the 24th Kentucky. And I found a newspaper clipping in a local newspaper here in 1919, I think, when W.R. Millward died. And the newspaper clipping had what it was a dispatch from the Confederate Veterans Association of Kentucky announcing the death of Colonel Millward. And it turns out, as you read through this little clipping, W.R. Millward was inducted into the Confederate Veterans Association as an honorary member. They liked him so much. And when he died, which is when this newspaper clipping was dated, the Confederate Veterans Association was ordering its members to show up at the gates of the Lexington Cemetery and follow Colonel Millward to his grave in honor of him. And as it turned out, there were something like 300 Confederate veterans showed up to walk behind that carriage with the casket to W.R. Millward's grave. I always was...
In 1919, that was probably a substantial number of the surviving ones.
It was. And they went all the way there, went through the service, because they regarded him at that time as a brother. Mm-hmm. And you go, why the rancor now? These are the men who fought one another.
Right.
And look at them.
Yeah.
And look what these people did after the war to try to mend this country.
Sure.
And Joe Wheeler, J.B. Castleman, what more could one do to try to mend this country than what they did?
Well, along those lines, I mentioned in my talks the example of the Virginia infantryman, Confederate, who lived in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, after the war.
Yeah.
And it became a newspaperman and did very well, and erected with his own money, erected a statue of a Union soldier in honor of the Union soldiers. This guy was a Confederate veteran and a combat veteran. And then around 1903 or 1904, the surviving members of the GAR actually mounted a plaque on the same monument with their own funds that said that we, the Union veterans of Martha's Vineyard, erect this plaque in honor of Confederate veterans.
Oh.
So there was so much reconciliation then, much more than now.
Yeah. Well, you've also in your book talk about Confederate veterans who became prominent in the United States government. Mm-hmm. And principally, I'm looking at the judiciary. Mm-hmm. You mention at least 3 of them who served on the Supreme Court of the United States, 4. And 1 became Chief Justice. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about those fellows.
Well, I didn't get too deep into it. The one was Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar, which we always get a chuckle out of the cool name, and he had been he had been Secretary of the Interior. Now, again, off the top of my head, I forget which presidents appointed these guys. Which may put in a little footnote here: 10 consecutive post-war United States presidents appointed former Confederates to federal government positions, beginning with U.S. Grant, mm-hmm. ending with Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. And I always put it, and then on the tail end, Calvin Coolidge retained a couple, but they were elder. He didn't appoint any. So again, I don't know who appointed Lamar. He was Secretary of Interior,
right,
and then he was promoted up to Supreme Court,
right,
and again, off the top of my head, there were 4. Douglas, I believe, mm-hmm. was one, and Hal Jackson. Mm-hmm. And again, when I discovered this, I'm thinking, there's the modern debate nowadays over were Confederates traitors, mm-hmm. or were they not?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the expression, one person's freedom fighter is another person's rebel, or whatever.
Right.
But I mean, to me, the argument is, who in the world would appoint traitors who just happen to get off mm-hmm. for whatever reason to be Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and some other ones that
right.
you'll probably
right.
mention here
right.
Later on. There were other positions. Well, not to jump ahead of you, but Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Yeah, and not just one. There were 2 U.S. Attorney Generals.
Who were former Confederates.
Former Confederates, yeah. The interesting one is Amos Ackerman from Georgia, and mm-hmm. he was appointed by Grant. Mm-hmm. And he was sort of controversial because he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, mm-hmm. and he only served for 14 or 15 months, and finally resigned. Probably Grant asked for his resignation, but he resigned because he was being too hard on the KKK. And he's from Georgia.
He's from Georgia.
He's from Georgia.
And the world turned upside down.
Yeah. So he also he organized or formed the first investigative office, if you will, or investigative unit of the U.S. Justice Department, which eventually evolved into the FBI. So he's not the founder of the FBI, but
the forerunner.
The forerunner of it, yeah.
One fellow, speaking of Grant, who became prominent in the federal government was none other than John Singleton Mosby.
Yes.
A favorite of mine, maybe because as a kid I watched The Gray Ghost on television, and it got me hooked.
Yeah.
Even though you look at it now and it's as silly as heck, mm-hmm. nevertheless it was an important thing to me. Mosby, of course, wreaked havoc on the Union Army's Sheridans and others in Upper Virginia, sure. Loudoun County and Warren County, et cetera. And he made a name for himself in the war. Had a bounty on his head half the time. But Grant really admired him, really liked him. Mm-hmm. And tell the audience what Grant did with him.
Grant actually, they first met, late, obviously they didn't meet during the war, Mosby mentions that after he met with Grant, it was something along the lines of, I think the general, his impression of me is not what he was expecting. So I think they hit it off.
They did
pretty well. I think that was almost unanimous among the research I did, which didn't always describe the initial meeting of a former Confederate, but of those that did, it's kind of like these guys met for the first time, and they all kind of liked each other. But Mosby was appointed consul to Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
Now he maybe Shanghai, one of the large cities, but Mosby was. As I understand it, I'm not a Mosby biographer. As a matter of fact, I haven't even read a full biography of Mosby. But he was kind of a feisty guy.
He was.
And he was one of these guys that rubbed some people the wrong way and didn't care.
Didn't care.
I think some of us rub people the wrong way, and when we find out, we do care. Well, he didn't care. And if you think about it, it's probably the right aptitude to be a diplomat in those days.
Yes.
Because you're really independent. And I
Right.
don't think you can get further away from Washington, D.C. than Hong Kong.
No.
And that was an important diplomatic, maybe perhaps the most important diplomatic position. But he stayed in China until he became elderly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they actually wanted to transfer him to some other city, and he said, "No, I'm going to stay here."
Mm-hmm.
But it would take, I don't know how long it took to get a message from one side of the world to the other in those days, but it had to be weeks. at the earliest.
Yeah.
And which again comes back around to this sort of overall theme of trust, confidence, respect.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to send somebody to represent the United States government in Hong Kong, and they have to get there by boat.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to give that person responsibility to represent the United States.
Yeah.
If you doubt their patriotism at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting. My family came from New York City, and my father was born in Brooklyn. And in 1956, we brought down from Brooklyn my great-great aunt who helped raise my father. And my great-great aunt, his father, who is my great-great-grandfather, ran Tiffany's when it was on Union Square. And I asked my aunt one Christmas Eve, sitting around a tree, did you ever meet any Civil War veterans in New York? Well, she said, oh, heavens, Kent, they were everywhere. And I said, no, anything in particular? And she thought for a minute and then said, well, there's one thing I do remember. I said, what's that? She says, my daddy came in and awakened me and my two sisters, one of whom was my great-grandmother, and told us to get our best Sunday clothes on because he was taking us into town. L.A. lived in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. Town is Manhattan. And she says, we all got dressed up, went over the Brooklyn Bridge, which just had been opened a year or two, and went to the store, which was Tiffany's. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 little chairs put up in the picture window, and me and my sisters were told to sit in those chairs. And we asked, why? What are we doing here? And they said, just be quiet and look out the window. And around the corner and moving in front of the store on Union Square was the funeral procession of Ulysses S. Grant. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, that you saw that? She goes, well, yeah. It was all 11 miles of it. And I said, you mean you saw Philip Sheridan? Yes. You saw William Sherman? Yes. How did you know? And they said, well, the old men would tell us. They were working in the store. There goes Philip Sheridan. I said, the Stonewall Brigade veterans were in that parade. She says, "I think so." And they were. So here's Ulysses S. Grant. You were talking about, this is what brought this to my mind. Here we are with U.S. Grant. Names John Singleton Mosby as the to Hong Kong as a virtual ambassador to the United States, for the United States. And here's Grant. He's named by Grant. And he's not the only one Grant looked to, who were former Confederates. He was very much interested in seeing them reassimilate, and that this be peaceful and there be harmony. But so much so that all the veterans of the Stonewall Brigade out of Virginia came up to New York and were in that procession behind that casket. Now that just stuns me. When you think of
Joe Johnston was a pallbearer.
And Joe Johnston was a pallbearer.
Yeah,
and Simon Buckner.
But I started to say Breckinridge, and thank you for
Simon Buckner.
Yeah.
They were classmates at West Point.
Yeah.
And so, Major General Simon, Lieutenant General. He was the oldest living Lieutenant General or general officer in the United States in the Confederate service when he died in 1918, 1919, something like this. Anyway. You had Joseph E. Johnston, Simon Buckner, and then hosts of these just infantrymen who served in the Confederate Army in the procession behind Grant's casket.
Also watching that funeral procession was a young boy named Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt, exactly, exactly.
Of
course,
he said that kind of generated his being intrigued with the military.
Yeah. Well,
and Fred Grant was again, I mentioned it in the book. Ulysses Grant's son was like the Grand Marshal at a parade. I was in Memphis or New Orleans, and the Confederate veterans were going by, and that they would break ranks. The old veterans, were in ranks, and they broke ranks, and they would all go up to the reviewing stand, and they were crying at the sight of Fred Grant. They called him General Fred Grant.
Yeah.
I guess it was more. It's like an honorary title, but yeah, there was so much. Now, I mentioned this too. I'm sure there were times that a Union veteran and a Confederate veteran got tanked up out west or something. and Marshal Matt Dillon had to come in and break them up. But no, I mean, generally speaking, and by the way, one of the founders of Macy's was a Confederate veteran.
Is that right?
I thought that's where you were going when you mentioned the Tiffany's and the store.
No, that's even yet another deal.
Yeah, no, it was two brothers, and they purchased Macy's when it was not what it is now, and they actually grew it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's interesting when General Roger Pryor from Virginia, Confederate general, fought at Antietam, among others. At the end of the war, he and his wife moved to New York City. In order to live, they took all their family silver to Tiffany's and got cash advanced to them with the silver as collateral. So they basically put up for hock everything they owned of value so that they had enough cash to get along. And Pryor wound up becoming a justice of the Supreme Court of New York.
Yeah.
And you speak of reconciliation. I mean, here's a guy in New York City settling down. And he's not the only one. There were just hundreds who did that. Right. Simon Baruch is one of the prominent ones. Why don't you tell the audience about him?
Yeah, Simon Baruch was a Jewish Confederate American, or I guess we would say a Jewish American Confederate American. Of course, he was born in Bavaria, so we can put that in there as well. As a young Jewish immigrant to South Carolina before the war, went through medical training and joined the Confederate Army as a surgeon, and we were talking here before we went on air. he is quoted as saying that he finished his training and he was assigned to the Confederate regiment as the surgeon, and he said, "I had not done so much as lanced a boil." So he was right out of med school.
Right out of med school.
Ended up with the 13th Mississippi, served throughout the war. He was quote-unquote captured at Gettysburg. He remained behind and rejoined. They exchanged, rejoined, stayed throughout the entire war. He went back to South Carolina and practiced medicine, and he went to New York for 1 year, just as a volunteer, to serve the slums. And I imagine in those days, the slums of any city were slums that we can't imagine today. Came back, resumed his practice, but only for a short time, then relocated permanently to New York. And I believe he lived there maybe 13, 14 years till he died. And he was very much into public hygiene, clean water, sewer. They were, they didn't know the extent at the time, but they knew there was a correlation between sanitation and disease. And Hell's Kitchen section of New York, which is appropriately named, he spent most of his time there. But he had a son named Bernard Baruch, who is sort of a famous, one of the early famous Wall Street financiers. Which we were discussing. And Bernard Baruch was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, World War I, that had to do with procuring raw materials, minerals, and for the war effort, for industrializing for the war effort. And after the war, after World War I, Bernard Baruch had made a substantial fortune and started endowing chairs, academic chairs, building facilities, med schools. The list is as long as you're on, in honor of his father. There's a school in New York City, Simon Baruch School, and a park. And So the Baruchs were. Simon Baruch, very famous and made so memorialized permanently by his son.
And these again are.
By the way, I mentioned this. Another interesting Confederate veteran I found was, and off the top of my head, it escapes me on my notes with me. He was the Senate Majority Leader in 1917, and drafted the U.S. Declaration of War against Germany in World War I. He was a Confederate veteran from Virginia. I hate to say that. I remember his middle name was Martin. But I can't remember. It's kind of like I can remember your Masterson, but not Kent and Brown. But no, he was president of the Senate or Senate Majority Leader and authored the Declaration of War, a Confederate veteran, U.S. Declaration of War against Germany in World War I.
Isn't that incredible? Just incredible. Well, we can then go to ex-Confederate officers who were in academe, presidents, first of all, of colleges and universities.
Just to quickly insert something before we leave public service, another one that just really raised my eyebrows to the crown of my head were the two U.S. Navy secretaries. There were two U.S. Navy secretaries that were Confederate officers.
During the war.
During the war were Confederates. And I joke, I said, these guys were actually put in charge of the ships they were trying to sink.
Only a few years, 20 years earlier. Yeah, exactly.
Or whatever it may be. But Secretary of the Navy. Talking about education. That's a long list. And again, I say this in each one of my presentations. Some of them are not surprising. It shouldn't surprise anybody that a former Confederate was a president of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa.
Right.
So But there are others that are quite interesting. Before I mentioned president, there were founders. There were many schools, universities, and colleges that were founded by Confederate veterans.
Right.
And like off the top of my head, Virginia Tech,
Right.
and Texas A&M, and others. But the ones I think that are kind of go against the grain of our modern narrative is that there were 4 schools exclusively for African American, for freedmen, that were founded by former Confederates: Alabama State, Alcorn State in Mississippi,
Right.
Prairie View A&M in Texas, and Arkansas Pine Bluff.
Wow.
So there were four of the, and they're still around, still flourishing as I think they call them historically black colleges now, but they're African American colleges, and some exclusively for women, because not all colleges accepted women. There's a pretty interesting list of colleges that were founded by former Confederates. And by the way, in my book, Ken, I'm like you. I'm exclusively a nonfiction guy, and those cursed footnotes that take you longer to write than the book itself, right? You know, does the comma go outside the closed parenthesis? You know,
and that changes like the tide.
Oh, it doesn't. In this one, and when I spoke to our friend Ted Savas, Savas Beatty, my publisher,
Ted's a good friend.
Yeah, and we decided I was just going to do a bibliography, but because the book would have been twice as long just with the footnotes. But the one once I did decide, I thought if I say that this guy was a senator from Missouri, somebody doesn't like that fact, and who cares? It's not going to raise a big ruckus. I thought, but if I say that somebody was a founder or co-founder of a university, there might be some universities that don't like that.
Yeah.
I footnoted those.
Did you really?
I did. I'm being honest here. But because really, what is a founder? It's kind of a fuzzy term sometimes. Like Clemson. Lieutenant Thomas Green Clemson.
Right.
He gave them the land and the money to build the first buildings. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But there are others where there would be like a governor who would say, like Alcorn State, I want a college there. And governors can cause legislatures to do things that they don't always want to do.
Right.
But I footnoted either from the State Historical Society or from the university itself.
Yeah.
There were probably 20, 30, 40 perhaps.
Yeah.
And in postgrad schools, like off the top of my head, University of Arkansas Med School, there were 8. It recognized there were 8 founders of it. 7 of them were former Confederate surgeons. So,
What one that shocked me was the ex-Confederate who became the president of University of California at Berkeley.
Cal Berkeley.
Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, that was we were just talking founders, and in the book I have categories. Like I broke it down into education, and then within the education category, I had founders, presidents, and directors. But it was John LeConte, and he and his brother were from South Carolina. They were brains. They were smart guys, mineralogists, chemists, and all that, and served in the Confederate Ordnance Department or Division.
Yeah.
But he and his brother went back to Columbia, or what was left of it, after the war. And in their memoirs, the other brother's memoir, he mentioned that they just couldn't get anything done there, so they went to California, like everybody did for many decades.
But not now.
Not now. They're kind of going the other direction, but that's a whole different subject. And he ended up in the San Francisco area, and he was not. He was the 2nd and 4th president of Cal Berkeley.
Unbelievable.
He was not the first. I thought he was the first president, but then I was giving a talk, and when you give a talk to 100 people who are really into history, there's at least one person there that knows
something about that.
all these little things. Yeah, he was the second and fourth president and taught there, and his brother. If I can lead into his brother,
yeah, absolutely.
His brother John LeConte also went to California and taught at Cal Berkeley for a while, but John LeConte became friends with John Muir, kind of an iconic naturalist preservationist,
Right.
one of the first naturalists. And Joseph LeConte and Muir were distressed at mining and logging and things that were going on in the Sierra Nevada.
Mm-hmm.
And they they're not listed as the founders. Teddy Roosevelt is considered the founder of Yellowstone. But they had a lot to do with Yosemite,
Mm-hmm.
and Joseph LeConte co-founded the Sierra Club
Incredible.
with John Muir, and this is a pretty progressive environmental group that was co-founded by a former Confederate officer.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
Just incredible.
And but anyway, there was Cal Berkeley, and again, a lot of the schools are not surprising.
Yeah.
But for instance, you're talking about. I was talking about Virginia Tech here. The president's home at Virginia Tech is called McBride House,
Mm-hmm.
over one of the founders and early presidents of Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
McBride he's a Confederate veteran.
Yeah.
Buchanan House at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis.
Mm-hmm.
It's named after Admiral Buchanan, who was an admiral in the Confederate Navy.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's there were Confederate veterans that served on the Board of Visitors of. I get West Point and Annapolis mixed up, in the Service Academies.
Yeah. James Lane became president of Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
And their football field is Lane Stadium.
Yeah,
it's Lane
Lane.
Stadium. Yeah. Well, we could go on and on with some of this. And of course, I guess the most prominent of all Confederates to become a college president was Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
Who became president of a little busted school in the Upper Valley named Washington College. And
it's funny in the book. I've spent a lot of time on a lot of guys because they did a lot. Robert E. Lee, how many books on the Confederacy do you ever have where Robert E. Lee just gets a sentence or two? Because that's all he did.
Right.
With air quotes, all.
Right.
As a matter of fact, when we were designing the cover, on the cover of the book, I actually have a picture of 8 different Confederates in their Confederate uniform, and then their distinguished ones with the white handlebar mustaches and the tie clip, the 3-piece suit as older.
And I love the Mosby one with his head leaning in his hand. It's a great pose.
But anyway, I wasn't going to put Lee on there, but then. My publisher and I talked to him. It's almost blasphemy not to have a book with a Confederate. Everybody's going to say, "Where's Lee?" So,
Where's Lee?
We put Lee on there. But yeah, and William and Mary was saved by the Ewing.
Right.
With his own money, rebuilt it because it was basically demolished during the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, but quite a bit.
Mississippi State University owes its origins to Stephen D. Lee.
Stephen D. Lee, right.
Who was served in Lee's army as well as in the Army of Tennessee.
Yep.
You could go on.
Evander Law, University of Florida, which he actually founded. There ended up being 4 or 5 public, quote-unquote, colleges. He founded one of them, and then at some point, the state combined them all into one central University of Florida. So he's one of the co-founders of the university. Yeah, it goes.
It goes on.
List
and
goes
on
on.
and on.
And as I mentioned in the appendix, as I was looking for founders and presidents, I came upon professors every once in a while, and some of them, and I went ahead and just put them in an appendix. But some of the places where it's taught. University of Vermont.
Yeah. Harvard. You got at least one Harvard guy in there.
Johns Hopkins, but the other was like Amherst. Yeah. a Confederate veteran at Amherst, and Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, Wisconsin-Madison.
Madison, right.
And University of the Pacific and University of San Francisco. A mayor of a mayor of L.A. while we're talking about
Berkeley.
Yeah. Well, no, a mayor of Los Angeles. I know we're getting away from the college, but a Cameron Tom was mayor of Los Angeles in 1900. He was a Confederate veteran. A mayor of Minneapolis.
Can you imagine?
Was a Confederate veteran.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And then, the great trade or professional associations, the American Medical Association.
Yeah. 4 former Confederate surgeons were presidents of the AMA.
Isn't that incredible?
Two of the ABA.
Wow.
American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Sierra Club. I mentioned. I don't know that LeConte was an officer, but he was a co-founder.
Yeah.
American Gynecological Association, just several of them.
Yeah. So to wrap up, Sam, how do you put into a synopsis of what these former Confederate veterans did to rebuild America after the Civil War?
Well, I think, the overall point after I finished my research, and you kind of, you step back and, what's your overall effect? What's the main effect? To me, it wasn't so much, or it wasn't necessarily, or only what the Confederates did, because these were high-achieving Americans, and if you're a high achiever, you're going to achieve highly wherever you are.
Right, correct.
What really affected me was what the citizens, what society, what the federal government thought. Mm-hmm. They entrusted these people. They allowed them to participate in the growth and the development of the United States between 1865 and 1910.
Right.
I think there was a great deal of respect. I guess maybe like in sports, it's a high profile program, and they play some little school, and the little school makes them work. Mm-hmm. You end up, even though they're vanquished and defeated, you respected them.
Of course.
So it's the former Confederates said, "We're Americans now." I mean, there's lots of quotes and things.
Right.
We're Americans now. We want to participate. We want to help grow it. And the rest of America said, "We want you."
Right.
We
want you.
We'll take you. We want you.
Right.
So
we need people like you.
Yeah, right. It's what they were willing to do, and it's what they were allowed to do.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
So it's like a 2-part thing.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Sam, look, thanks. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed talking with you. Yeah. And it's a fascinating subject, and one that really needs some real play in today's life. Yeah,
it's I wish I had either a copy of the book or at least the information in it. I wish I had it on the desk of every decision maker.
Yeah.
Who is making deciding on what to do with that Confederate monument or with that building or with naming that street.
Right.
It's just before you do it, let's get to know these people.
Get to know these people.
Get to know
right.
them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks again, pal.
Thank you.
Good seeing you.
Lots of fun.
It was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Become an American hero who participates in our mission by joining us at witnessinghistory.org. Download our documentaries and free teacher education materials that conform to grade level education standards at pbslearning.org. Follow Witnessing History on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn.